I love this slide. Here's a group of people who seem to have cracked sustainable, affordable and effective to me, but it's probably not the way that most of us would feel entirely comfortable travelling, although they seem pretty cheerful, so it's a slide I'm very fond of. I sit on the Committee on Climate Change, and I'm the advisor on the committee that looks at how we decarbonise transport. So what I'd like to take you through in a relatively light-hearted way, because it's an evening and I don't think we should make you work too hard in the evenings, is really some of the thinking that's behind our recommendations on decarbonising road transport that come through in the reports of the Committee on Climate Change, which form the kind of underpinning scenarios to the UK's carbon budgets. And the UK now has carbon budgets that run out to 2028, which indicate the rate at which we need to be reducing CO2 emissions from our economy. So let me start with just telling you what I'm going to talk about. I want to talk about climate change and where our emissions targets come from, just as a little bit of introduction. But I hear that some of you will have been to one of my colleagues' lectures earlier, Sir Brian Hoskins. He's the climate scientist on the Committee on Climate Change, so if you came to that one, you'll know all about the background to what I'm going to say, just as an introduction. I'll then say a bit about road transport emissions, both in the UK context, but also in the global context, and look at the ways that which we can look at reducing transport emissions, and then go on to talk a little bit about the fact that if we're going to reduce emissions by 80% in road transport by 2050, we need some pretty radical approaches. And then I shall just end up on my pet subject, which is why I really do think, and why the Committee on Climate Change are very much pro-electric vehicles. So and I know it's controversial, so I'm very happy to discuss that at the end with people who don't agree. But let's just start with why emissions targets are so important. If we continue on the trajectory we're on in terms of global CO2 emissions, there is a high probability that by the end of the century we'll see global temperature rises of more than 4 degrees, and increasingly the climate modelers are saying that could come as early as 2060. Now, I don't care about that personally, I won't be here. But many of my students will, and they do and should care about it. So, and I care hugely about them. But of course, an average temperature rise of 4 degrees, we don't all share that equally. And of course, we don't share that across the seasons equally. It could mean in London, on the hottest day, temperature highs of 50 degrees centigrade. Just imagine the Tube at 50 degrees centigrade. It would be an absolute death trap. So that's pretty uncomfortable. But actually, in the UK, we are one of the least affected countries by all of this. By that time, southern Spain is uninhabitable in the summer, completely uninhabitable. Now, we did once have a wonderful navy, and when the Spaniards came marauding, we used to shoot at them. But I'm sure that's not somewhere we want to go again. So, you know, it won't just be migrants coming from very poor countries. It will be migrants coming from countries that currently we go on holiday in quite frequently. It really does start to give us all sorts of interesting and difficult challenges if we get to those sorts of levels of warming. And of course, not only do we have all that additional migration, but we start to be into serious shortages of food, with very significant reductions in crop yields in key countries. So in countries like China and India and Bangladesh, where they already don't feed their populations, reductions in rice yields of 30% would be absolutely disastrous. And 3 litres of water a day translates into a bath a month. That's not fun. and that assumes you don't drink any of it. So, 40% of the world by 2080 could have less than 3 litres of water a day. That's a really serious water shortage. So that's the world we don't want to bequeath to the next generation and beyond. And to avoid that, the scientific evidence is very strongly, of course we don't know exactly, but it's very strongly that we need to reduce our CO2 emissions quite radically. So where does our target in the UK of achieving an 80% reduction in emissions from 1990 levels by 2050, where does that come from? Why is that? Why do we get to that figure? Well, the scientists agree that we need to cut global emissions by about 50% in order to keep temperature rise, to keep likely temperature rise to not much above 2 degrees. Of course, all of these have probabilities associated with them. They're not exact predictions, but that's their best kind of central estimate. That means by 2050, we've got to have got down to 22 gigatons annual global CO2 equivalent emissions. And of course, all of our modelling tends to assume we stop at 2050. Oh, we've done it if we get to 22 gigatons by 2050. But actually, we have to more than halve it again in the next 50 years if we're going to stop the globe from continuing to warm. So if we think 22 gigatons is a challenge, future generations have got to get it down to 9 gigatons by the end of the century. The number of people will have gone up from something like 7.5 billion today to 9 billion people. So if you've got 22 gigatons and 9 billion people, that means they get 2.5 tons approximately per year each. In 1990, in the UK, we accounted for 12.5 tons of CO2 per year each. So if we're going to get down to 2.5, that's where our 80% emissions reduction target comes from. It comes from the assumption that we should distribute allowable emissions fairly across all of the inhabitants in the globe in 2050. So that's the target that is embodied in the Climate Change Act, which was passed in the UK in December 2008. And that's what our carbon budgets are designed to do. They're designed to say, these are allowable carbon emissions in 5-year periods out to 2050, and we have set, and in legislation, the budgets out to 2028 so far. We don't set them all at once, because we don't know how different technologies are going to progress and what would be sensible pathways. But we have set them out to what's called the 4th carbon budget that goes out to 2028. So my area of that is in particular the area of road transport. So let's look at the road transport emissions. London may feel like this, but as you can probably guess, this is actually, I believe, Shanghai. It's about 17, transport in total is about 17% of global emissions. Road transport is more like 14%, as we heard in the introduction. In the UK, of course, in developed countries, it's significantly higher than that. So for the UK, it's 20% of our emissions. And in the US, it's a terrifying 33% of their emissions. That's what gas-guzzling vehicles does for you. Already, the roughly 1 billion vehicles on the planet use more than half of the total oil that we produce. And, this is the area that after power generation, after electricity generation, this is the largest source of emissions in rich, developed countries. So transport is a very key part of our work on the Committee on Climate Change. And of course, it's something that we can all affect very directly. We may not have much effect on the emissions from our power stations, but we all contribute very directly to transport emissions. Of course, in the UK, we're looking at, if you like, the behaviour of a middle class, of a country of middle class, pretty much city dwellers. But actually by 2050, if the United Nations predictions are correct, we will actually be a world of pretty much middle class city dwellers. So today we have in the global population, 30% are estimated to be rich and middle class, and that roughly correlates with the urban population. By 2050, with our 9 billion people, 70% on, well, it's difficult to say on current economic growth patterns, because this UN data is from about 3 years ago, so some of this will be rather pre-recession predictions. But, you know, there is a hope and an expectation that living standards around the globe will have risen, and we'll be looking at something that is more like 70% of the world being rich and middle class, and that will correspond pretty much to an urban population of about 6.5 billion. So we will have living in cities by 2050 about the same number of people as we have in the entire globe today. So urban life is going to be a very important feature, which is actually why how we behave in the UK is going to be very much like how much of the world may behave in 2050. So in 2010, we had 6.5 billion people, and we had nearly 1 billion cars, 850 million to best estimates. In 2050, 9 billion people. We've moved from 3 billion to 6.5 billion urban population. We've moved from 30% to 70% in that category of rich and middle class. We might well have 3 billion cars in the world. Indeed, if they all had as many cars as the Americans, we'd have 6 billion cars in the world by 2050. I think it's unlikely that everybody will want that many vehicles. They have pretty much one per head, but it's unlikely that we'll get there. So when we look at the transport challenge, here is emissions from vehicles from land transport in the UK for the latest year we have it, which is 2008 in detail. And the majority of them, 73%, is from what we call light-duty vehicles. That's cars and vans. The second important category is heavy goods vehicles, and that's a category that's been growing, or rather historically in the last 20 years it's been growing, but actually, of course, in the last 3 years it's been shrinking because of the impact of the recession. So cars and vans is the first challenge we have to address. After that, we have to look at heavy goods vehicles. However much diesel fume that you see buses pumping out, they are actually a very small proportion of our transport CO2 emissions. So much as it would be good to make them better, it's not the first place to invest effort and money. This one, I think, is really important for those of us who have cars. This, to me, gives you a feel for the scale of the challenge. That we've got to get down to 2.5 tons of CO2 per person per annum. And if you drive an average, sorry, it shouldn't say new car, it should say an average car in the UK, that's about 160 grams per kilometre. If you drive it a slightly less than average mileage, you're already using your entire 2050 carbon allowance. That is your 2.5 tons per annum. So that makes me feel quite guilty, actually. And that is the scale of the challenge. You've got to compress your life into carbon emissions that currently your car gets to use. So that is the scale of the challenge we have. The good news is, of course, actually in the area of cars, we know how to do this. The other part of the challenge is that every year in the UK since 1950, pretty much, we have driven further. So that's also a trend that we need to address. I actually think this is a really interesting chart because it's a very good indicator of recessions. There we are. That's a recession. Look at this. That might even be the start of a recession, just appearing there. But unfortunately, it recovers quite fast once we get back to higher levels of economic growth. So if that trend continues, it's also something we need to address. But actually, if we look globally, we see pretty similar trends. The miles driven is, as you might expect, going ever upwards, And particularly as we all move into cities globally, the urban miles driven is going up even faster than the rural miles driven. The next part of the global challenge is, of course, that of vehicle ownership. The predictions for car ownership in countries like India, in Brazil, in China, are of rapidly increasing car ownership. And of course, we're already starting to see that in China. So we have almost 1 billion cars today. Some predictions suggest by 2020 that number will have doubled. Certainly, lots of the predictions suggest it will have doubled by 2030. And as I say, a significant probability, high probability, in fact, that we will get to 3 billion cars, 3 times as many cars as we have in the world today by 2050. Now, if you're selling cars, that's extremely exciting. That's an enormous market to look forward to. If you're trying to reduce emissions, it's an interesting challenge. And this has nothing much to do with emissions, but I just think we need to remind ourselves sometimes that we mustn't let the cars take over. So this is not an interesting piece of graphic art. It is actually Albuquerque, New Mexico. And everything in blue, it's blue for me, it's sort of bluey grey for you. Everything in blue on there is space devoted to cars. So the deep blue ones are the multi-storey car parks, and the pale grey ones, I think for you, are the surface parking. And of course, the straight lines are the roads. I think we might decide that actually we want some space back, and we should allow more space for human beings than we do for vehicles. It does have a link to the issue of emissions, of course, because this kind of density of cars causes congestion. And congestion is a major contributor to emissions. An MIT study suggests that when people are in urban areas, 40% potentially of the fuel is used by cars looking for parking. And a study by Andreas Schaefer and his colleagues at Cambridge shows that urban transport is twice as energy dense as transport between cities. So congestion is a major problem in terms of high levels of CO2 emissions. So one of the things that I looked at in the King review was how do we achieve, in a country like the UK, emissions reduction? And this is actually rather a beautiful picture, I think, of Hong Kong, but showing that they have rather a lot of emissions from at night from other things than vehicles. But actually Hong Kong has some interestingly similar challenges to ours, and it was a recent visit to advise their government on how they might look at reducing transport emissions. But essentially we can be more efficient ourselves, and that's something I want to do my Billy Graham bit with you and encourage you to think about when you leave this lecture. We can think about how we design more efficient cities, and of course we can produce much, much more efficient cars. So we can not be like this, of course, the congestion that's contributing to emissions. We can all make a big contribution. If you need a particular type of vehicle, say you've got 7 children or whatever it is, you need a big car. We're not going to argue with you about that. If you simply choose the lowest emitting vehicle in the class against the average car that people buy in that class, you can reduce your emissions per kilometre by between 25 and 40% with models that are available on the market today. So making the right choice in the showroom for people buying new cars has a huge impact. You can, of course, choose to drive a smaller car, but not if you've got all those children. Eco-driving training, something that not enough of us do. Some people have seen 25% reduction in fuel consumption after they've been on eco-driving training courses. And for van drivers and small goods vehicle drivers, where of course they can be incentivized by their employers to use less fuel and also where they tend to have more information about how they're driving given to them by their their vehicle information systems, they have shown that you can consistently improve fuel consumption by levels of around 15% if you incentivize people properly after eco-driving training. And yet we haven't yet introduced eco-driving as the core of the UK driving test. A sensitive issue for all of us, I think, in the UK. If we simply enforced speed limits on our motorways, we could save a significant amount of CO2, and if we reduced them to 50 miles an hour, we could save 20% of CO2 from driving. That is, I think, a staggering figure. And I think when we think about increasing motorway speed limits, we need to think about safety. Casualties, deaths go up rapidly above 70 miles an hour, but so do CO2 emissions. So we should I think about enforcing speed limits on motorways. And of course, the sorts of things we're starting to see in London, car clubs and car sharing and good public transport are all critical. Actually, if we could get people to change their behaviour, not even make their lives terribly uncomfortable, we could tomorrow probably reduce 50% reduction in emissions from transport. However, it's very unlikely that it will happen because it requires a level of direction from government that most elected politicians would find very, very hard indeed. And we need to help them because we elect them. So, we need to be prepared, I think, to support, for example, enforcing motorway speed limits. So, traditionally, it has been very hard to achieve these savings from people's behaviour. And so, sadly, in our predictions on the Committee on Climate Change, we actually put quite small percentages of these possible savings into our forward predictions. And here's one of the reasons why. This is an interesting study from the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi, looking in a very congested city at what is the quickest way of getting door to door. And any of you who've been to Delhi will know quite how congested it is. But their findings, I think, are quite counterintuitive. What they show is that, and here are the cars, the ones that I've coloured in. What they show is that until you get to a 12-kilometre trip, so these are 3 kilometres, 6 kilometres, 12 kilometres, 24 kilometres, until you get to a trip of more than 12 kilometres, a car is the quickest way to do it. So the others are various combinations of public transport and for these shorter ones, bicycling and walking. And simplest one, there's no walking on 6 kilometres, but you've still got cycling. It's until you get beyond 12 kilometres, the car is still, despite all of that congestion, unfortunately, your quickest and your most convenient way of making that journey. It is really hard to get us out of our cars with data, with evidence like that. So I think we have to recognise that behaviour change will deliver some good things, but actually we have to also look at how do we have extremely low emission cars in our cities. This is one that I always think is really the version of this diagram that went into the King Review, which was a version from 2006, so several years ago, is the one that I always think is a really, really positive chart, which is, this shows you for the typical way we categorise vehicles, so from mini, small super mini vehicles up through luxury sports cars and up to MPVs. It shows you the range of CO2 emissions of vehicles on the market in 2011, in this case, in the UK. So a huge range. Luxury cars up to above 400 grams per kilometre, down to under 200 grams per kilometre. This black line shows you the average vehicle in that class that is purchased. Oops, I haven't got much battery in there. And obviously the bottom line shows you the minimum one, And we're just starting to see electric vehicles, so those are those yellow regions. So the Tesla would be the electric sports car on this classification at 0 grams of CO2 per kilometre. But if you compare the bottom of the blue band with the average, then you can see the kind of emissions savings you can get, and they range up to 37%, but they're typically 30 to 40%. So if we can get people better information, help them make better choices, then you really can, even with conventional vehicles around today, you really can reduce CO2 emissions. So I say that the disappointing thing, in a way, is that although there are so many things we can do personally to reduce emissions, in our prediction for the reductions we can sensibly deliver by 2020 on the Committee on Climate Change, which were used in formulating the first 3 carbon budgets, we only actually assume a 6% benefit from improved driving behaviour and persuading people to move from their cars to using public transport, etc. So we've got reduced car use, a scheme called Smarter Choices, which is rolling that out to every city in the UK where people have much better information about what their public transport options are. Where that has been rolled out in the UK, we've seen a persistent reduction in car kilometres of somewhere between 5 and 7%. That saves us something like 3 to 4 megatons of CO2 a year. Eco-driving, we've put a saving of 1 megaton. Enforcing the speed limit, 1.3 megatons. Reducing it to 60 would save us another 1.45 megatons. We haven't actually included that in our modelling because we don't think that any government would want to do it, unfortunately. All of that gives us about a 6% saving. The majority of it comes from the fact that average new car emissions have to come down to meet the new European target, which is 95 grams per kilometre by 2020. So we're not contributing much, but actually the car manufacturers are doing an enormous amount, driven very much by the new European targets, legislative targets. And this is what's been happening in the UK in terms of UK new car emissions. And since 2007, they've been falling very fast indeed. And I would love to be able to say that my review for the government is the reason for that. Sadly, I think I'm probably well trumped by the recession and the fact that people have realised that you can now buy some really good cars with much lower emissions levels, which save you an enormous amount of money. So we've come down from 2007 at 165 grams per kilometre to significantly under 140 in 2011. It's a fantastic increase in the rate of reduction of CO2 emissions. As you can see, here's the increased slope on the rate of reduction of CO2 emissions. And as you can see, we've moved from 2000, when the average new car had a fuel consumption of marginally below 40 miles per gallon, to a situation where it now has a fuel consumption approaching 55 miles per gallon. And given how much fuel prices have gone up, that is a huge benefit in these difficult times. So there's actually a very positive story in the UK about the reduction in new car CO2. That's the one part, I would say, of actually our carbon reduction targets that we set from the Committee on Climate Change, where we're achieving even faster than we had predicted we would. The sad thing, of course, is the impact of the recession means that the number of new cars sold in 2011 is half the number of new cars sold in 2007. So although there is this great new technology, we aren't affording to buy new cars because of the economic situation. So we're not rolling over the car fleet as fast as we would have been 5 or 6 years ago. But hopefully things will get better, and hopefully people will continue to buy these excellent new vehicles. So we can be more efficient as people, and we can design better cities, and we can put better public transport into them. So here is something rather horrifying, I think. In Calgary, 90% of trips are made by car, whereas in Hong Kong, that's less than 20%. And when I was in Hong Kong, they tell me it's more like 10%. So here are the goodies and the baddies. This is the percentage of journeys taken by private vehicles, and along the bottom is GDP per capita. So we can do the fair thing, and we can compare cities that are kind of equally rich. So if you take Hong Kong, has a high GDP per capita, marginally higher than London, about the same as Berlin, and rather similar to Calgary. And you can see we have a North American pattern where we get up to more than 90% of journeys taken by private car. We have a good pattern where a range of places like Tokyo, Amsterdam, where around about 20-25% of trips are taken by private car, and we have a kind of European pattern on which London, with its very good public transport, falls pretty much just below. So there is a huge difference here, and if we could persuade everybody to ride bicycles like they do in Amsterdam, we'd be very much better off. But Hong Kong is an absolute star performer. And why is that? Well, we know exactly why the North American pattern happens. And that's because in North America, we have small, dense city centres, but city growth occurs by the design of gated communities around lakes, further and further out from the centre of the city. And the density of those communities is not high enough to sustain any kind of affordable public transport. So the more and more you grow your cities by dispersal, the more and more likely you are to get up towards that North American pattern of the proportion of trips by private cars. So we really do need our city designers to recognize that growing cities by compaction is the way we have to go. And of course, that's what Hong Kong has to do, because it's actually in a very confined space. All of its development has to occur by compaction, and it has a very good public transport system to serve its citizens. So really, really radical impacts from city design and, of course, the critical public transport system that goes with it. You do indeed need carrots and sticks. The carrots are frequent, subsidized, cheap, secure, pleasant public transport, and the sticks can be all sorts of vehicle taxes, congestion charging, very expensive parking, etc., etc. So we can be more intelligent. We can design more intelligent cities and put good public transport systems into them. But of course, we still have the Delhi problem. And the Delhi problem is that even in congested cities, short journeys are typically quicker by car. And when it's raining and you've got a heavy briefcase and you're dropping the children off to school, lots of us are going to use the car. The good news is that even with conventional internal combustion engine technology, we can get that 160 grams per kilometre probably down to about 80 or 90 grams per kilometre with some mild hybridization and some improved efficiency. That is, I think, a fantastic achievement of technology and of our automotive designers. We can reduce vehicle mass. I have just been completely overwhelmed, I think, by the things they have been doing recently at Jaguar Land Rover. They have a really big program of developing really low-emission luxury cars. And one of their most beautiful new models weighs 180 kilos less than the equivalent 7 Series BMW. That's phenomenal. For the first 20% roughly of reduction in vehicle mass, you reduce fuel consumption and hence emissions by about percent for percent. So that's, phenomenal. They're making some really great, if you must have a big car, I don't think you should have a big car really, but if you must have a big car, they have some phenomenal models in their new range. You can improve the aerodynamics, you can reduce the drag, you can reduce the powertrain internal losses. Some of the new engine oils give you 3 to 4% reduction in internal losses. I think that's phenomenal from high technology oils. You can look at low rolling resistance tyres. Some of the new low rolling resistance tyres reduce fuel consumption by 3 to 4%. So phenomenal combination of the chemistry and the physical structure of the tyre and the way it absorbs energy. Really exciting developments. So there's still a lot to go at in conventional vehicles, and for the next 20 years it's going to be the dominant contribution to what we save is going to come in road transport is actually going to come from these sorts of improvements to internal combustion engine vehicles. But if we're going to get a 50% global CO2 reduction by 2050 and an 80% reduction in developed countries, then we have a big challenge for cars. So let's do some simple arithmetic. Let's say today's emissions from cars are 4x. We have to get that down to 2x. Let's assume we can get, optimistically, 25% improvement from behavior change, so 4x to 3x. But remember, we've got 3 times as many cars, so that gets us back to 9x. 50% reduction from this fantastic internal combustion engine technology, we're still at 4.5x. To get down to 2x, we need an 80% reduction, at least, in per kilometre emissions. And we probably need more than that in developed countries, because actually in developed countries, our target is 80% reduction by 2050. So we have a huge challenge that goes beyond internal combustion engine technology. And here are the options. And I'm going to tell you, I think one of these options is one we need to be doing much more of now. But I'm not really that partisan, because I think that if we're moving from 1 billion cars to 3 billion cars, we need all the solutions that we can deliver. Our problem at the moment is that we rely on steel cars with a single fuel. If we're going to multiply the number of cars by 3, we don't want to be reliant on any one material or any one technology. So I think there will be room for all of these, and I think we will need all of them. At the moment, however, biofuels are quite challenging. It is the sheer volume of liquid fuel we use in cars. So we don't have room to grow the crops that you would need to do it. We don't have enough waste of the right kind to process into it. And if we have to use biofuels, there are some applications like aviation where we won't have any alternative in the timescale out to 2050. And there are some applications like generating power where we can actually use biofuels. If we put carbon capture and storage on a power station, we can actually use biofuels and generate negative carbon emissions. So we can do a net removal of carbon from the atmosphere. And since we're going to need all the help we can get, that is the most logical place to put them. So biofuels are not top of my list. That's a shame, because actually, of course, they will work with all the rest of the existing technology and distribution system that we have. Hydrogen is a very interesting option, very clean, zero CO2 tailpipe emissions. There are some great hydrogen fuel cell solutions beginning to be developed, looking to be at quite reasonable prices. But the challenge is we have to make the hydrogen. And if we end up making the hydrogen from electricity, then hydrogen is a much more expensive way of powering vehicles than using the electricity directly. If we're going to decarbonise the UK, and indeed the world, transport is going to be probably our second priority, because the first thing we need to decarbonise is our electricity generation. It contributes 26% to our annual CO2 emissions at the moment versus 20% for transport. And at the moment, our grid runs at a carbon intensity of somewhere around 500 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. It varies from about 550 down to about 450 because it depends on how many of our nuclear stations are running. It depends on what the contribution of wind energy is at any particular time. But 2010, the average was 490 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. If we replace the aging power stations that we have in the manner that we model in the Committee on Climate Change's reports, we can easily get down to about 300 by 2020, and it's perfectly feasible for us to get down well below 100 by 2030. And you may have seen the arguments in the press that we have recommended to the government we should be setting a target of, in the energy bill, of 50 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour to drive the essential investment that we need in renewal of our nuclear fleet and indeed in further offshore wind developments. If we drive our electricity system, as we need to do, down that path of emissions reduction, this is how beneficial electric vehicles are. So let's start on this axis up here. We have effective vehicle emissions, grams of CO2 per kilometre. That is the emissions from burning the fuel, if it's petrol or diesel, plus the emissions from producing that fuel. So it's slightly higher than the figure you would see standard for the car. So at the top we have our standard petrol car, which is something like 160 grams plus the odd 12% or something for the production of the fuel. The green line is then the full hybrid petrol car with the allowance for the production of the petrol. The yellow line, labelled ultimate internal combustion engine, is that 80 grams per kilometre, plus a bit for the fact we've had to produce the petrol. And the red line and the blue sloping lines are an electric car and a hydrogen fuel cell car on the assumption that we have hydrolyzed water using the electricity generating system to produce the hydrogen. And so what you see is that today the electric car is just slightly better than your Toyota Prius. But by 2020, it will be about half the emissions of your Toyota Prius, and by 2030, it will be down at something like less than 10% of the emissions of your Toyota Prius. And the hydrogen car by 2020 is still slightly worse than the petrol hybrid, but of course by 2030, the hydrogen car is also coming down to some very respectable emissions levels, but it has required us to build quite a lot more electricity generating plant to provide the power to produce the hydrogen. So I think there is a very strong argument that where we can use them, electric cars are a very sensible solution today. Actually, electric cars preceded the internal combustion engine. This is a wonderful electric car of the 1890s called La Jamais Contente, and it beat all of the internal combustion engine vehicles in a race in Paris in 1895. Most of us think we drive a lot further than we do. So clearly, at a reasonable weight of batteries in a medium-sized car, at the moment you get an electric vehicle range of probably 60 or 70 miles. This is actually from the transport surveys, the detailed transport surveys that are done. This is actually how and where we drive in the UK. And the vast majority of our trips are under 50 miles. The vast majority of them. In fact, remarkably, daily driving distances are very, very consistent between Europe, the US, and the UK. In the US, 80% of drivers drive less than 50 miles a day, well within the range of an electric car. In the UK and Europe, it's something of the order of 35 miles a day. 80% of drivers drive less than 35 miles a day. Extraordinarily consistent. It's thought to be something to do with an innate human tolerance of sitting in a car and driving. And that's about as far as you can go before you feel it's too far to drive to work. So actually, daily driving distances for most of us are well within the range of an electric car. This is what our electricity usage looks like through the night and the day, and the bottom line is for summer, obviously, and the top line is for winter. If we could persuade everybody to behave entirely logically and simply charge their electric cars at night, then even in winter, in the nighttime dip, we could charge 15 million electric vehicles. That's half the number of cars we currently have in the UK. That would be pretty good, actually. It would actually make our electricity system more efficient if we had a much more constant load on the system. So it would actually be a very good thing to do. So it would take us years to get anywhere near 15 million electric vehicles, but it's just, the point is, it isn't a huge additional load on the electricity system if people charge them at home at night. And before you say, well, nobody can do that, London is very atypical. 60% of households in the UK have off-street parking. Probably none of you, I'm afraid, but those of us who live in the provinces have off-street parking, I'm afraid. So my advice would be, at the moment you can get £5,000 from the government towards buying an ultra-low emissions vehicle. There are salary sacrifice schemes which enable you to lease them before paying tax and national insurance. And although it isn't true yet, by 2020 and probably before that, the running costs of your electric vehicle will make them competitive, if not cheaper, than conventional vehicles. So this is something that I think is very exciting, something we're going to see more of. But however, it is something, because of the cost, we do still need to see government policy helping to drive change. But in 2011, over the last 10 years, alternatively fueled vehicles have risen from almost zero to 1.3% of market share. In our predictions for the Committee on Climate Change, we suggest by 2020 they need to be up at about 17% of market share. The recession has been slightly problematic because they are more expensive, but I think it's not unrealistic to think that we're starting off on that path and we could get close to where we need to be. And just to emphasize, there is now an increasing range of electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles becoming available, and indeed there is at the Paris Motor Show, your Metro will have told you, there is a plug-in hybrid SUV with a 35-mile electric range and a 540-mile electric and petrol range, I think it was. So it's really becoming a reality to buy these vehicles. So I think that takes us towards a very pleasant vision, a vision that says we are going to be able to address this issue of reducing CO2 emissions. So we will have temperatures that enable us to continue similar lives to the ones we have today. If we changed from petrol and diesel to electric, we could turn Los Angeles into the city of Birmingham, which is where my university is, with beautiful clean air. We could have silent streets, and we could retain and indeed improve our current levels of personal mobility. And of course, there is always a Dilbert cartoon for everything. I thought this one was rather good for... and there are lots of people I need to say thank you very much to, lots of people who have helped in both our work on the Committee on Climate Change and also on the King Review. These are some who've made a particular contribution. If you want to read the King Review, if you can't sleep, it's still on the Treasury website. And the Committee on Climate Change reports are on the ccc.org.uk site, and we produce 2 or 3 a year. New carbon budgets, monitoring progress against existing ones, lots about low carbon transport in those. And I'll just leave you with my favourite efficient people. Thank you very much. Right, let me start with air transport. Air transport accounts for about 3 to 4% of total UK emissions if we include our international air transport. The problem is that there are very few significant solutions for air transport between now and 2050. Airbus have just produced their overview of aircraft sales out to 2030, and it shows that they're aircraft that we would recognise with emissions, with fuel emissions that we can pretty much, they'll get a bit better, but they're pretty similar to what they are today. Even by 2050, we're not going to see radical changes in aircraft design that will give us, 50, 60% emissions reduction. And with the rate of growth of air travel, as all of those new middle-class people, that number of rich and middle-class people rises to 6.5 billion of the 9 billion, the growth in air travel is huge. That's one of the reasons why biofuels may be a very important part of reducing emissions from air travel. And it's one of the reasons why we should be cautious about thinking about using them too extensively in road transport, because we may need them somewhere else where there is no alternative. In some of our scenarios out to 2050, because of our inability really to have a dramatic effect on aviation emissions, we have the previous government set a target that we should aim to reduce aviation emissions back to 2005 levels by 2050. The rest of the economy is getting back to 80% reduction on 1990 levels by 2050. That's the impact of the growth in aviation. And the fact that we don't have a lot of solutions. We have to have a very high energy density fuel if we're going to get an aircraft off the ground and fly to Australia. So liquid fuels are just about the only solution we have. So if we get back to 2005 levels by 2050, aviation and shipping will account for something like, I think it's 40% of our UK allowable emissions. We may not think, or rather the population of 2050 may not think, that actually that's the way they want to spend their carbon emissions, if you like. That aviation, air travel may not be such an important, if it's going to take up all of that allowance in terms of emissions. But it's a real challenge, aviation. Not that the airframers and the engine manufacturers aren't working very hard to produce more fuel-efficient aircraft. They are, because fuel is 60% of the operating cost for the airline. So there's huge pressure to reduce fuel consumption. But some of the really radical designs of aircraft, even if we were running prototypes now, we wouldn't really be seeing them on our runways much before late 2040s, early 2050s. And they wouldn't be replacing most of the current fleet that we have, or the current sort of designs that we have. In all of our modelling for the Committee on Climate Change, we assume that cars have the distribution of lives they currently have. So they have a distribution of lives around about 12 to 13 years in the UK. And we assume that distribution in our modelling. We've just actually been revising our modelling and thinking, in fact, because car technologies have improved so much, because body finishes have improved so much, and because we now know that the impact of the recession is going to be limiting economic growth right out for probably the next 10 years or more. We've actually just started modelling, looking at assuming we start to see a significant increase in the age of the vehicle fleet. So, you know, that goes into our replacement rate calculations. We generally don't, we aren't strongly supportive of car scrappage schemes for the reasons that you talk about. We don't want people taking a lot of recently manufactured vehicles and buying new ones. Scrappage schemes might be sensible if you would only let people buy vehicles at less than 90 grams per kilometre, having scrapped a much larger vehicle. That's, you know, there's a point at which they do become sensible, and you can do all those calculations, of course. In fact, the government's scrappage scheme about 2.5 years ago now, was it? Which actually at the time we opposed from the Committee on Climate Change, because we were coming into recession, people's behaviour was such that they scrapped large cars and they bought small cars. So our calculation of the impact of it was that actually it has been a net benefit. We were trying to persuade the government at that time very, very hard to say that when you scrapped a car, you could only buy one of the very low emission diesel or petrol vehicles that were on the market with your scrappage allowance. But in fact, that's what people did anyway. They didn't have to be persuaded because of the circumstances. So that actually worked quite well. But yes, you want to be careful if you bring in scrappage schemes that you're scrapping old and high emissions vehicles and people are buying low emissions vehicles, because as you say, for the reasons that you say. I mean, we're again we're starting a big program of modelling of whole life emissions, of the sort of carbon footprint, if you like, of all sorts of things at the moment for our next iteration of the carbon budgets and performance against carbon budgets. And we're looking in detail at where the emissions in conventional vehicles and battery vehicles are likely to come, both in manufacturing and use. But I think in a mature manufacturing situation, it's unlikely that a battery electric vehicle will actually have very significantly higher manufacturing emissions than a current internal combustion engine vehicle. Apart from anything else, it will be quite a lot lighter, so it will use quite a lot less materials in the body. It'll have simplified fittings. Typically manufactured, typically a car today, 15% of the emissions associated with its life are associated with manufacture and scrapping, recycling at the end of life, and 85% are associated with the emissions during use. I mean, obviously it varies with the particular model and the size, but that's about an average sort of figure. So you're right, we have to take that as the emissions come down from the use phase, the emissions from the manufacture and the recycling become a more important part, and we do need to take that into our total calculations. At the moment, in our calculations, those emissions are actually captured in our industry emissions and in our electricity generation emissions. So if the thing is made in this country, those emissions are not lost. They are part of the calculations that we do. I think, alongside we have all sorts of technology and behavioural solutions which can help us reduce carbon emissions, but I think what your comment really does sort of reinforce the point that actually there will be a lot of global changes associated with increasing temperatures. It will actually, if we don't manage to mitigate significantly will increase global refugee problems very, very significantly. And sadly, I suspect, along with that, will go problems like terrorism as well, because of the perception that some parts of the world, like Europe and the United States, have caused the problems of, you know, some of the much poorer parts of the world, and that isn't going to gain us any friends. So, you know, there's a lot of political implications, I think, of climate change, as well as, you know, the physical implications that, and the physical implications for those of us who are scientists and technologists are, you know, much easier to address, and I think we need to get the focus on that. I like your idea of signs on motorways, and it would be good. One of the challenges is, of course, that it's an invisible gas. It's quite hard to get people to feel very excited about it. We do have on all of the new car labelling, it does explain to people the CO2 emissions, but of course that's not the high impact part of the label. What we can get people to talk about is the reduction in fuel consumption. And that's what, for most of the population, that's what we can motivate them around, and that's what we need to do. That's what's going to save them money, particularly at this time. So, you know, that and the labelling of used cars, so that people buying a used car are also being made aware of the fuel consumption and the fuel savings they could get by going to what I would see as a lower emissions vehicle, but a lower fuel consumption vehicle. It's probably more on most people's radar. In a way, you kind of illustrate the Delhi problem exactly, that even for quite short distances, for most of us, even in congested cities, but in places that don't have the level of public transport that central London is lucky enough to have, public transport journeys are not very efficient or effective, or they're very unpredictable. So we do have to have, for people who are not in the Hong Kongs with fantastic public transport, we do have to have really low emission vehicles so that they can do what they need to do, get on with their lives, contribute to the economy conveniently. So very low emission vehicles are very important, and your kind of journey distance is perfect for an electric car. I think that's a good point, and I would agree with you. I think when you analyse the trips people make in almost every country, 100 miles is actually a range that many people can live with. The other ways we can get around that are, of course, that some of the plug-in hybrid vehicles with a range like this new SUV that's coming out from Mitsubishi, or I can't remember who it was actually, with a range of about 35 miles, seemed to me an extremely good idea, because they cover most people's daily motoring, and yet they give them that ability to take the family away for the weekend, which, you know, is the usual constraint. So I think we actually have solutions coming onto the market that will suit a lot of different driving patterns. BMW have taken, very interestingly, a very different approach, which is that they're introducing their 2 new electric vehicles in this concept of I-mobility. So they're putting them into the concept of us all being very interconnected, and that should you just tap into your mobile phone that you actually need to go 200 miles on Thursday, lo and behold, you will wake up and an alternative vehicle will be waiting for you to go 200 miles on Thursday. It will be taken away again, and you'll get back into your little i3 and people to and from work in enormous comfort and great fun. So there are lots and lots of solutions to this. And if I look at the way our students approach travel, it's very different from the way I've approached it. If I look at the children of the people I was at university with, many of whom now work in London, they have no aspirations to own cars. You know, my kind of feeling about these city car clubs is it might not be clean. They don't have any of that. That's, they think it's incredibly convenient not to own a car, to pick one up on the corner and drive it somewhere, drop it off. I think it's a very different world. And in cities, these electric vehicles with ranges of 50 to 100 miles will be an incredibly efficient way of dealing with cleaning up cities and dealing with city transport problems whilst reducing emissions. But, the long distance ones are sadly some way away. But, they don't make a significant contribution. We have to start introducing these technologies so that manufacturers can afford to invest in the R&D and the cost reduction to make them mainstream. That's the challenge. And if we're going to get those better battery technologies for 2040, which is when we really start to need them, we've got to have people doing the R&D now, haven't we, to get things in 2040, 2050 timescales.
Thank you very much to Professor Dame Julia King. It was an absolutely marvellous lecture tonight. I think not only have we had the challenges laid out in front of us, but for once it's really nice to see some clear solutions and something that we can do something about. Not only something that chemistry can contribute to, but something that we personally can take responsibility for going ahead and helping to solve.